And this guy just came to me and asked me about it. And I was like, who are you? And the guy was, well, we are Oracle. And I was like, oh, damn. All right. If Oracle is using this, there's a business in here somewhere, right? The way that you get efficiency gains is by not hiring new people, but actually training your team to be a multiplying force. So what we realized is that this idea of multi-agents allows you to not only customize them to take different roles, what translate into better outputs, but also allows you to have each agent use like its individual LLM. One thing that I realized early on when I was building these agents is if you think about these LLMs, right, they're similar in so many ways with regular AI models that we are very used to, right? Where you have a set of features that you know and you're trying to create a prediction for something that you don't. There's no word that people are not going to use agents. Like that we're long past the horizon of being able to return that way.
Hey everyone, thanks again for joining us on the Unpacked Pod. Before today's episode, I want to thank Stifel Bank for sponsoring the show. For Geodesic Capital's fund banking and my own personal wealth management, Stifel is our trusted partner. Now, onto the show.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Unpacked Podcast, the podcast for operators by operators. I'm your host, Vignesh from Sierra Ventures.
And this is Arvind here from Geodesic Capital. And again, welcome to all our guests for coming onto this pod and being loyal, customers of this pod. I think this is going to be another great episode. I'm pretty sure because I've interacted with Joe many times, and he's very conversational. So and I think he can be. He can have spicy takes. So let's hope that that comes through. But with that, welcome Joe to the podcast. I think Joe is the CEO of CrewAI, a very strong contender and player in the agentic frameworks and beyond agent orchestration space. But we're going to talk all about agents. We're going to talk all about what Crew does. But before that, the first segment of this pod is always about learning a bit about the founder journey, how they come to be where they are. So with that as context, Joe, why don't you give us the high level on how you got to where you got to be and what was the aha moment to say, all right, we got to do Crew.
I love that. Hey there, everyone. Very excited to be here. Yes, this story, honestly, I wish it was more of a sexy story. It's not that much. What happened is before CrewAI, I was running all AI and enterprise projects in Clearbit. Clearbit's a company that I was working there for 5 years, all the way for us to getting acquired by HubSpot. And we're doing a lot of these AI things. Like before, it was kind of like mainstream, quote unquote mainstream, how it is today, right? So we're doing a lot of like embeddings and RAG. And this was like mid or early 23, but it's early given the current scale of things. And my wife actually came to me and she said like, hey, you're doing all these interesting things, like so many interesting projects. You should be more vocal about it. Like you can get invited into podcasts and all these different things. I'm like, oh, you know what? I think you're right. But I kind of suck at writing kind of like LinkedIn posts. And it felt like a good side project. Like, can I create agents that help me run my social for me? And those were the first agents that I built. And they worked so well. Like I started using them to make posts. So I would put one random idea and they would do the research, how they fact gathering and come out with an angle and look at my resume and my previous experience to find an interesting angle. And for a hot second, I thought this is a product, LinkedIn kind of like management for like everyone. And then I wanted to build other agents. And then I was like, wow, I feel like there's so much boilerplate, things that I'm copying and pasting. There should be a better way. And that's how I got to start building CrewAI. And I remember that I kind of launched the first version on my anniversary. And my wife was not very happy about me getting a computer in our anniversary trip. But that's how things started. And from there, we grew into a business by the sheer pool from potential customers, like trying to use this in a production level.
Very cool. Hey, I'm curious. Just as you've seen just as you saw kind of the world out there before you started building With LangChain, I guess was one of the first ones, and over the years there have been more agent builders. But could you just maybe start by giving everybody a little bit of the landscape of the world as you see it? Just because there's so many agent builders out there, like what makes Crew different? Like why do you guys why are you guys the best agent builder out there?
I gotta say, that's such an interesting question. When I look at the industry right now as a whole, there is a race to the bottom on lowering friction for building agents, right? There's so many ways from OpenAI doing their thing, their thing to LangChain, LangGraph, CrewAI, N8N. There's so many different takes on like building these automations, right? But what we realized from the get-go is the building an agent is not where the value is. And this might be a hot take, but building the agents is the tax that you pay to actually get to value. The value only start to occur, or you only start to cashing out once this is deployed and running in production. So everyone in the industry from the get-go seemed to really focus on like, oh, let's actually focus on the learning, building, and the prototyping stage. But when you want to get into production, that gap there, that effort's way, way, way longer than kind of like just getting these things built out. And a lot of the things that get in the way are sometimes not even AI related, right? You go into some of these big enterprises and they're like, well, I need to run this on my own infrastructure. I need role-based level of access. I need a dedicated IP. I want to make sure that there's no PII or personal information in there. So a bunch of interesting questions. I think our angle from the get-go is, well, we want to focus on getting people in production, running live, getting value. And that has been our angle from the get go. And that is translated into a lot of different aspects of the business. For example, we're doing way more top down sales where we focus on the enterprise deals. And the open source helps the community and helps smaller companies to get things up and running. But when the bigger companies want to actually get things in production, that's kind of like when we step in. So I would say the unique angle that CrewAI has is on the open source side, there's nothing easier to use. And I stand by that. Like we hear that from the community all the time. Is the easiest way to build, the fastest way to build. And then on the enterprise side, I think we're the only ones actually working on all these features that allow those enterprises to get into production with confidence, right? That would be how I would put it.
Uh, how would you classify easy? Because I mean, you emphasize that. Like, what does that easy mean to you, to your customers, aka developers? Because I think and I know you went live with the open source as well, right? I think you
Yeah.
guys want something. Uh, we are getting into the meat of the conversation, so let's do it. I mean, like I thought we would have a few more minutes to get there, but looks like we are there. I guess we
No,
can't have an AI conversation getting too soon, I guess. But please, yes.
no, I love that. Those are great. Those are great questions. So yeah, when I think about easy, it's funny because we made the framework easy, not as a goal. It's just a byproduct as the way that we build it. So on the technical side, when I started building the open source, I was bringing a lot of my experience with another technology called Ruby on Rails. And Ruby on Rails is known for being like the super easy to use. And the way that they achieve that is by this concept called convention over configuration, meaning that as long as you follow the convention that they establish, you can move extremely fast and things just work. So when building CrewAI open source from the get-go, I was trying to strive for the same thing. Like I know there's a few things that I wanted these agents to do differently. They take different roles, they have different tools, they have different tasks. But other than that, they look very much the same. Like I want all them to have memory. I want all them to be able to execute. I want all them to be able to connect to any models. So you have all these things. Like, well, can we abstract that away for this customer? So that's what we initially built, and people really like that because it gave them a mental model to think about these agents and these automations that made it extremely easy to grasp. And then eventually what we saw on the market is there are certain use cases and there are certain engineers that they actually need more of the control. They want to make sure that they do more of the traditional if this then that, and eventually they can opt in into adding agency or not. So we end up doing CrewAI flows later that I would say that it's even easier because basically allows you to write regular Python, but with a lot of like basically syntax sugars, easy ways to configure some like what happens in what order. And you can choose when you want to have an agent or a single LLM call or an entire crew of agents doing something for you. So when I think about easy, I think like speed to value, like being able to sit down and build something. I literally today can build a crew within less than a minute and kind of works.
Hey, Joe, can you maybe talk a little bit about just generally the approach that you've taken to build this? I mean, you emphasize kind of the call it the control layer, right? Like code to control how these agents work, and this and obviously that you guys are known for the multi agent approach that you're taking here. Um, a lot of other companies have gone either like no code and just make it super easy to build, and then some companies have said single agent. Like, why did you guys take this approach of being focused on code plus multi-agent? Like, where do you see the world going? Why is that important?
That's a good question. And we also have a no code platform now that came later, and I can explain why we built it and how that came together. But it's exceptional. Um, well, first, one thing that I realized early on when I was building these agents is if you think about these LLMs, right? They're similar in so many ways with regular AI models that we are very used to, right? Where you have a set of features that you know, and you're trying to create a prediction for something that you don't. For example, if I want to predict what is the likelihood of raining, I might use like what is the location, what is the time, and what is the season, and then I can predict like whether this is going to rain or not. And these LLMs are doing the same thing, but the features are all the words that have been typed up to this point, and they're trying to predict the most likely next one. So that's where the idea of a prompting comes in. Like what you write actually can very drastically and heavily influence what is the answer that you're gonna get. So we noticed that if you make these models role play into a specific role or a specific assignment, you actually get better answers from them. And you can actually test it out. You can go in ChatGPT and say, give me a stock report on Tesla, and you're going to get one kind of answer. And then you start a new chat and you say, you're a FINHA approved investor with a lot of X credentials. Now give me a report on Tesla. And you're going to actually get a different answer. So what we realize is that this idea of multi-agents allows you to not only customize them to take different roles, what translate into better outputs, but also allows you to have each agent use like its individual LLM. Where if you're doing some coding, maybe this agent uses Claude, maybe the other one uses OpenAI, and the other one uses a local model. So there's like a series of benefits that we realize, and that's why we end up doubling down on multi agents for sure. And the coding piece was again, this came from my own experience, right? I'm an engineering by trade, over 20 years on building like all sorts of systems. So I wanted something that I could use myself to build my agents. And now we launched the no code platform, and that is actually was customers asking because some of these customers of ours they start to expand into no business user after they start to get these use cases out. And now the IT departments or the engineering departments already paved the road. They have the tools, they have the agents, they have the guardrails. So they now want to allow non-technical people to basically build within that sandbox. So basically, that's when we came up with the no-code platform, more because of customer pool on expansion in these accounts.
Hey, Joe, I know we dived right in, but I want to take a step back and the audience may be very ends of the spectrum: AI native, AI not native. So if you could sort of peel the onion layers here about the platform that Crew is building, like and that will be helpful to sort of guide people and us as well. So why don't you take a crack?
Sure. So the TLDR here is, and you probably were able to read between the lines by now, but we started as building a framework, so something focused for engineers, technical people, to build these agents. And this was back in 2023. So again, was early for a lot of these engineers and companies, and people started building these agents to create all sorts of automations. Then what we realize is, and it's funny, the first company that actually ever reached out to me and say like, hey, we're actually using your open source. Can you help us? Was here in the ferry building in SF. And this guy just came to me and asked me about it. And I was like, who are you? And the guy was, well, we are Oracle. And I was like, oh, damn. All right. If Oracle is using this. There's a business in here somewhere, right? And that started that pool from these bigger companies. And then I just met thousands of them. And I asked all the questions that I could, like what do you need, what is working, what is not working. And then we started building this product that we called CrewAI Agent Management Platform. We call AMP for short. And then we started selling this commercially. And then what we start to see is that there was a lot of traction in there. So if you look at our customers, you're going to find the US Department of Defense, veterans associations, and the government. You can go into CPGs and you're going to find like huge CPGs like AB InBev or PepsiCo. You can go into the financial and you're going to find Royal Bank of Canada. So basically start to see traction across many different verticals on helping these companies actually get value. So not only building, but actually feeling confident to deploy these things. And I would say that's how the company came together. And the platform today is where you deploy these agents, where you build these agents, where you monitor these agents, where you integrate with external platforms from Arise to ServiceNow to all those different things, right? And that's a little bit of kind of like what we're seeing. So that's the TLDR. And the main angle here for people that don't necessarily know agents, we're talking about automations using AI. So you can think a lot of any sorts of automations, but most traction is with back office kind of
Okay,
automations.
Joe, also maybe to put it in context, could you just give a couple examples of what your customers are actually building and what they're doing with Crew AI?
Yeah. So one good example that I think, let me give you two examples that I think will make it easier for people to understand different ends of the spectrum. One is a financial institution, and what they're doing is automating the know your customer process. So all these financial institutions or insurances companies, they always have this idea of like a new customer come to us, we need to learn everything that we can about them, right? So right now it's a very manual process where they need to pull tax statements, they need to make sure that they find out the information that they need and they log out that out in this customer kind of like profile. And that process can actually take weeks, depending on kind of like if you're talking about wealth individuals or whatever that looks like. Now, we're seeing banks automating that entire process using AI agents. So the agents are now gathering the data, putting the report, finding any outliers, calling these APIs, and making decisions along the way. That has been a very interesting process. Another process that might be more relatable for other people is this idea of reimbursements. This is a huge CPG. They basically, as any company that sells some things to consumers, when you sell these things to consumers, they basically you get a reimbursement requests, right? Some of them are going to ask their money back. But the problem is, believe it or not, there's people trying to scam these companies, right? And as one would expect, this becomes then a very manual process where someone needs to make a judgment call on is this a scam or not? So they need to look at the request. They need to see if it's a new account, if it's a node account, if it's a recurring thing. So there's a lot of things in there. And that process used to take 3 days for them to approve a reimbursement. What for filtering out scams is great. Someone that really wants their money back, it sucks. So now they automated that with CrewAI agents, and that actually brought it down from 3 days to 10 minutes. So huge efficiency gains on that. So those are two examples that might help people kind of like understand the kind of automations you can do, but there's many more.
Maybe just turning the topic a little bit. So you got a good sense of what the platform is, what they're using it for. You touched on this briefly earlier, but Crew AI has been really driven. Adoption has been driven bottoms up, and love to understand. And one of the things that we try to do on this podcast is try to provide tactics, like how can other people be successful and learn from the best. How did you get the early traction that you got for Crew AI? Like, what was it about your open source or your bottoms up project that really got it to work? And obviously, I'm sure a lot of learnings from Clearbit, since you guys were very much a bottoms up sort of company at Clearbit. But yeah, how did you guys get the initial surge of traction?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think like looking back, there's a few decisions that I made early on that had a huge positive impact. One of them is from the get-go, I wanted this to be the kind of project and company that has a face. I was like, you can think about companies, and some companies don't have a face, right? Like, if you're into finance, you know like who these people are. But if you ask for the regular citizen, who is the CEO of Intel, they will know. Like, well, I have no clue. I know the company, but I don't know the CEO, right? But you ask them like, what about Apple? And they'll know, oh, Steve Jobs, right? Like there are companies that have faces, there are companies that don't. And I don't think there's anything right or wrong. But I look at like everyone out there, and everyone that was doing agentic, they didn't have a face. And I was like, I want our company to have a face. And it started with something very silly. My whole thing was, I think people will churn less if they if they think they're churning on someone instead of a company, right? But that was my initial like idea that brought into that. Like, well, people won't churn on Joe, like they'll feel bad about it, right? So they like it's gonna be a good experience. So from the get-go, I have been very upfront. So early days when I launched the platform and then we launched kind of like the framework, I would record videos. I would my social accounts, my personal accounts, not the company accounts, and I would push this as much as I can. I would record videos like sometimes three, four, 5 times a week and just share and keep pushing that online. And then I would post them on YouTube. I would put them on X. Just being very public, like almost building in public. I wouldn't say that it's all the way to building in public, but like close to that, right? Where basically I was carrying out a lot of the marketing from the early day on. And up to this point, I still use my personal account to drive a lot of the business. Like my personal like identity and the company became very intertwined in a way. What I think has positive impacts. Like does get in the way a few times because as my role kind of gets more complex, you get less and less time that you can do it, but I think has been a positive impact. So honestly, I think being shameless about pushing this out there from the get-go, being the face out there and doing all the videos and really kind of like doubling down on that had a huge impact on adoption early on. And I think what people picked up that they really liked was in a tech full of uncertainties where everyone's trying to figure it out, us providing a very simple like understanding and abstraction on top of it that creates a mental model made this stack way more adoptable. Like people were really trying to see like how should I actually do this, and we coming up with a blueprint made everyone very susceptible to say like, oh, I like this, I get this, I'm gonna do it.
That's great, Joe. I guess I was just reflecting on this human element of and playing the psychological game of sorts. That's a smart one. I also saw that on the website on your LinkedIn banner. There's a human. I think so. That's kind of cool. The the holy grail of open source is like how do you sort of provide enough value in the open source domain, and yet leave just enough so that they will go and sign up for that managed service, right? So anything that has worked for you, I'm sure it's an iterative process. You guys are in figuring it out as you go along, but um, what are you guys doing on that? I mean, how are you guys working on it?
Yeah, I gotta say that's a big thing for all open source companies, right? And a few companies did amazing at that. Other companies kind of like struggled into that. We all have examples from both sides and kind of like what worked and what didn't. I think in the company, I think like some principles really helped us. Like the idea that one, you need to understand that open source something is not a two-way door, right? Once it's out there, it's out there. So whatever you open source, you can take back, right? And that is something that you need to be very mindful about as a company overall. Now, in the end of the day, I think, or as you said, like it's a constant adjustment and evolving process. But at the end of the day, what we realize is that this building process is very, very commoditized, right? And that I wouldn't care provide that value for free. And that is kind of like where we start to land into, right? So, like the idea that you can build, like for example, I want to build any sort of AI automation today. Like I got so many options. We just talk about some of these companies, right? I can go into all of them. Why not make it extremely easy? So, for example, if someone wants to use our no code UI today, that is free. People can sign up and basically do it. That is actually another important thing that we realize in the company. Like it's not a coin that only has two sides, a spectrum. So it's not like, oh, open source or paid. You also have free in between. And you have trial and you have all these different other things that can work on your favor, right? So we decided like, all right, we're going to make everything about building with code. We're going to make that open source. Anyone can use it. Anyone can see it. Anyone can help. Anyone can improve it. Then, then we're going to get all the everything that are valuable but are related to building in some way, and we're going to offer them for free. So we're still at least know what kind of like we're doing, and that is important for us because it allows us to basically shape the company. But you can use it for free if you want to. So traces are free with CrewAI. The studio to build with no code are free with CrewAI, and I think you can even deploy your first crew for free as well. There's a few things in there, but then when you start to getting into the things that actually will help these companies to get into production and all those features, then that is where I start to get into dimensions like basically part of the platform. So those are some of the insights that we got. I think this idea of understanding there is something between open source and pay that you can leverage is was a big unblock for us.
Yeah, and I think you're spot on about that because for every enterprise, and especially with something like this where it's such a brand new technology, you kind of have to do the crawl, walk, run thing, and so like enabling them to walk before they run makes sense. I guess in that vein, Joe, can you just give us a little bit of the state of the union on like what actually are you seeing in the enterprise in terms of AI adoption? I mean, obviously, all of us, I'm sure, hear about it, read about it, but then you see the hey, what 95% of AI things fail in the enterprise, the MIT report. I'm always a little skeptical of like how these numbers are actually calculated, but a longer conversation. But what are you actually seeing with your customers on like where are they deploying stuff? How far along are they in the journey of actually getting AI into production?
Yeah, I gotta say, like yeah, that MIT report. There's so many things that I think that are wrong about it, but I think you get one thing that I think is right, and that is when we're seeing companies fail, and usually that's like when these companies are coming to meet us and say like, "Oh, we had a bad experience with X, a bad experience with Y, like we're looking to you, like, can you help us?" And what we see a lot is these companies they usually fail on the planning process. It's not even the tech because the tech is there. You can build amazing things today. I mean, some of these use cases that I mentioned, they're not only live, but they're earning hundreds of thousands of times now. So it's insane. So the tech is there. You can build these use cases. But a lot of these companies, because they're rushing into this, they don't spend time planning. They don't spend time figuring out what's the success criteria. They don't think about how they're going to measure this over time, and that things like really hinder your ability even to call a project successful or not, right? Now, with our customers, we're seeing they actually get into production. That has been very exciting. And what we're seeing, it's growing on um, okay, growing an importance for their business, right? So we have some like customers that are actually public traded companies, right? Most of our companies now are there, but some of these companies, it's becoming as critical as some of these conversations are made all the way to their board level. And now we're finding ourselves in interesting ways because some investors that are in the board of these companies are now calling us and they're like, oh, like let's chat because we understand that you folks like we're using CrewAI on our company and we're talking about that in the board and now I want to hear from you and all that. So it's interesting some of the dynamic that is happening in there. But what I would say is, again, the customers that are putting in the prep time to make sure they're thinking about the process, they're scoring these processes, they're selecting what they do, they're moving faster. We're seeing a few adoption patterns. For example, with LLMs was very much adoption on the edges. Like someone randomly in marketing start using OpenAI, find a good prompt, and there you go, right? But now you're leaking information. Like that was not the vendor that was procured. The person's using their like personal account. Like they're not sharing their knowledge with anyone. A bunch of problems. What we're seeing with agents is more of a central adoption where there's usually an engineering and IT organization that is adopting it, and they're creating the registering the LLMs, like basically paving the road, right? Like adding the guardrails, adding the PII, personal information filters, and all that, writing the policies, and then these organizations starts to enable the other departments, either technical or non-technical, to start building these agents within that kind of like that arrangement. So that's one of the patterns that we're seeing that like some of these companies are being successful. And there's a set of like day-to-day use cases, I would say, like that are lower in complexity but do pile up that people might do things like, oh, automate my email, prepare for meetings, right? They're on the simpler side but they're interesting. And then there's more the transformational use cases. They're like, oh, there's going to be across an entire business unit or maybe two or three more business units, and we're seeing that being a little more driven by the technical team in general. So those are some of the patterns that we're seeing that are making this agents like this agents and companies successful. But we're seeing like all of our major customers get into production and just moving very fast into this. We have there's one customer that I actually met last night and just told me like we have over 1,000 agents built with CrewAI and they're running on a air gapped environment. So it's good that I got to meet them to didn't tell me that because I didn't know like how many agents they actually were using, but it seems they're really doubling down on it.
I think You mentioned something very interesting there that I want to double click on. It's most it's not a technology problem. It's sort of a implementation problem, and then sort of maybe goes back to the organizational readiness. From your experience, if you could sort of identify two or three attributes in your customers, in your enterprise customers, that sort of speaks to, all right, this is the sort of archetype of why a customer is going to be successful with Crew, and then maybe that becomes your staging gate as well. Okay, I'm not going to onboard any customer. I know you're very particular about that. You want a customer that actually is going to be ready to get the benefits of Crew. So if you could identify those few
Yeah.
attributes.
So there's a few things that we filter out in qualification, and there's a few things that even though we don't filter, if we observe that like that pattern was like early on after they became a customer, we know they're very likely to get success. On basically the qualification criteria, we very much optimize our teams. Like when they're engaging, they're bringing someone technical. That usually correlates a lot with like success, especially on bigger, longer cross business unit use cases. Two, there needs to be exact buy-in, right? Like this is not something that we're selling into middle management. This is something that we're selling on an executive level. So there needs to be some executive buy-in into that. I'm like, oh, like, all right, we're actually going on with this, and this is like how we're planning to roll this out. Uh, Three, and this is a pattern that we see, is like when we're selling Crew, there's an element of this company understand that if they're trying to optimize for efficiency gains, the way that you get efficiency gains is by not hiring new people, but actually training your team to be a multiplying force. So this understanding that like, oh, I want to qualify my team to actually take full use and make sure they're using the full value of this, that is very important. So some of our customers, for example, just a couple weeks ago, we had someone fly back from India because they're in there actually training 300 engineers from one of our customers. So this idea of like, oh, I like this, and now I want to train all my people to make sure they use to value. That is a great signal for us, right? That like, all right, these guys are really serious about it. They actually want to like use this internal team as a multiplying force to kind of like build those things. So those are some of the traits that we're seeing on these companies that usually tell us like it's a good tell. Like, all right, they're actually going to be up to the right extremely rapidly. And one thing that I would add is companies that understand what are the things, what are the box that needs to check to get to production, because that's, and I think that's where the Nanda paper got right. It's like where these projects die is once like they get into like prototyping extremely fast, but getting into production is it's harder. And a lot of these things sometimes are not necessarily hallucinations or guardrails. You can get those done. Is actually like they don't have an enterprise grade tool. That's it. They have an open source framework. They might have like an SMB platform, whatever it might be, but they don't have an enterprise tool. So they knowing like, oh, we're going to need run this in an air gap environment. We're going to need this to be in a dedicated IP. We need this to make sure that it's running on a FedRAMP high environment. Like knowing all those things from the get go really helps them and to make sure they're checking these boxes early on.
Hey, Joe, one of the other questions I have for you. So you've talked a lot about the agent building process, but especially as you go into the enterprise, there's a lot of data curation, data cleansing work that needs to happen in order for them to be even be ready to be ready to build agents. Obviously, as an open source business, that's not necessarily in your domain, but I'm sure there's a lot of that you guys do to try to enable your customers. How do you help your customers get to that point? Like, are there tools? Like, what's been the, I guess, the business approach to help these customers? I guess, or I guess, maybe put it another way, how do you meet the customers where they are today?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. There's an element, I would say, there's the data ops side of things where, like, well, depending on the use case, if they want to touch into their raw data and that might be in a data lake somewhere, then there's a bunch of questions that come from that. Is data ready? Is data formatted? Is data valid? Right? There's a bunch of things. I heard from a partner actually last week an interesting story. They're building something internally. They're not using CrewAI, and they're trying to build something from the ground up that would allow was a conversational agent, right? And they built something, and when they're about to go live, actually the security team pulled the plug on the whole thing, and they're like, "You're actually exposing data they're not supposed to." And they say, no, no, no. We checked all the permissions. So we made sure that our back is being respected and all that. And security say, yes, you did. The problem is these documents were tagged wrong in the first place. There is a tagging problem on the data side, so you cannot roll out. And they're like, well, but this problem already existed. They're like, yes, but now you're making it extremely easier for that to like basically bubble up and people see it, whether before they would need to go out of their way to find it. And they had to stop the whole thing, redirect the engineering team to fix that. And that took 9 months to actually get into a point where like now we can roll it out, right? So that was an interesting one. And I gotta say, some of these customers for the use case that touch in kind of like this foundational layer, we tend to kind of like go out and help them. A lot of the process that we do, we have an entire kind of like what we call use case flywheel process, right? So again, when a company kind of like is coming to do business with CrewAI, what we're selling them on is the actual result. So we really make sure that we get them there. Part of that is going these customers with a playbook because from qualifying the use case and having that understanding like, oh, this is a killer use case but relies on data that is not ready, and I have this other use case that drives impact, can be big but don't rely on that and I can actually do it, means that I might want to start with that one to get a quick win before I start to expand, or I might stack them in a few different ways. So from that kind of like playbook strategy all the way to the playbook to the actual agent lifecycle development, what is slightly different than a software regular life cycle development, it's something that we provide them with like intel information and like how to do it. And sometimes we do with them. Like I have been like in basically exec level meetings where we're talking about, let's go over the use case, let's talk about ROI, think about how we prioritize them and figure out the next 4 or 5 that we're going to do. So there's an element of helping them with that for sure.
That's a lot to unpack, but I think it kind of leads to a question in my mind, which is around moats in AI, right? And I think I'm curious to hear your perspectives on it because I think is an associated philosophical comment is that doing hard things, and I think you've chosen to go into the biggest enterprises versus trying to sell mostly to venture-backed companies, which is it's easier, perhaps, but maybe you have a spectrum of it. So doing hard things, going enterprise, building a platform that is enterprise grade. But does that naturally help you to build a certain moat? And how do you think about differentiation and solidifying your position in the enterprise mind?
Yeah, that's a great point. I don't know if I would call it like it's so hard to think of moats in this day and age because again, the AI lowered the bar for so many things that it used to be moats for many people, right? So that's an interesting kind of like way to think about this. But I do think that that is part of the differentiation, and the idea of like doing the difficult things is definitely one thing that we talk about internally, right? When we thinking about these use cases, and I don't want to downplay. I think like going bottoms up is not easy, right? You got to figure out so much in there to make that actual POG motion works in a way. But I do think that right now for where we are, people are very tired and sick of the fluffiness, right? Like people don't want to kick the tires on this. And I know there's a lot of companies, and this might be a little bit of a hot take. A lot of companies are shooting for their 0 to 100, 150 million ARR ASAP. How I can get that? And I mean, those numbers are great and they're very exciting and they're hard to get, but it does brings the question of like if it's so easy to get the ARR, how easy is to lose it, right? What happens when churn catches up with the ARR trend? And also like what is the actually gross margin on this? Or even more important, what is the NRR on this? Like are you actually getting value from this or not? So I do think there brings a lot of questions. And I think a few companies they're actually growing and actually checking some of these boxes are exceptional, but a lot of the companies out there are not, right? They're just like, all right, let's bump this number up as high as we can, then we figure it out. What is a business strategy? Again, everyone do their themselves, right? But in the end of the day, the way that I'm thinking about Crew AI is I do want to go into this business and ask them like, what is your most complex use case and how we can help with that. I think again that is more regular enterprise sales. That's harder to get. It might be longer sales cycles, but once you're in there. And it's not a fluffiness. You're actually helping these companies get to value and you get to tell the story later. So I think there's a value in there that people do recognize. The fact like you create these long time partnerships, you help them to get into the other place of this. Otherwise, everything becomes very transactional. And then I think for me as a founder, you start to asking like, well, what the hell am I doing?
Well, I mean, in some ways, it kind of goes back to your old "hey, people don't want to turn on Joe" strategy, which I guess is applying to the enterprise as well. But the other thing that you said in there that I'm curious how you guys have architected this or thought about this from a technical perspective is like, look, yes, you want to go help somebody with their most complex use cases, but when you help an enterprise, especially with these complex use cases, so much of the data and the information is stuck inside people's heads. How do you get that information out and build that context layer?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think sometimes what we're doing with these customers is this idea of it's funny. One of our customers has started calling this jet skis. So it's this idea keeping on the crew team maybe. Like we build these jet skis, and the idea is how many people can you fit in a jet ski? If you got a big one, maybe three, right? So creating these tiger teams that actually can go after kind of like some of this like these opportunities, actually pursuing them and basically reporting back to the mainland, right? And then bringing like bigger support boats. So it's almost like you meet the business like people that have the knowledge where they are, and you bring the jet ski into there to drive change very quickly. Like get the information out, spec the use case, maybe build a prototype, then report back. Like, can we actually get this done? Let's bring a bigger team. Let's actually get it over the finish line. That's kind of like the strategy that we are seeing that is interesting and kind of works out. We have been also experimenting internally on actually productizing that. Where like, is there a way that we can automatically map these processes, right? And there's a lot of ideas. There's actually something that we are trying, and it's a partnership with another company as well, where like would companies be okay with get an extension, for example, in their browser, and you map out the process as it happens, and now you can identify based on that. That feels like an interesting approach. Now getting extension in browsers on enterprises, that's a challenge in itself. So I don't know if that is the way to go, but I do think that there's an opportunity in there that hasn't been cracked yet, and like how you automate documenting, extracting this use case and the processes. So to your point, like there are things that are not even in people's head. It's just muscle memory, right? Oh, I switch tabs all the way to go into Salesforce to copy this field every time because this field matters to me before I go into a sales call. Well, how we surface that, right? Because that makes actually a big difference for this person. So I think there's some points on that we're experimenting with, but so far I think meeting this kind of like the business side where it is to drive change in there has been the thing that works the better.
I guess in go to market for AI companies, it has always been talked about distribution is king, right? And I think along this conversation, you kind of mentioned a couple of times about this partner, that partner. So I'm just curious about how do you sort of, in your mind, think about go to market with partners and onboarding them earlier than later in your journey. Of course, you will have direct sales and all that, and you will have a PLG, but partnerships are very critical. So how do you sort of think through that? I mean, again, it's in the context of being it will be helpful to the founders and operators listening in as well.
Yeah. I mean, I gotta say, especially if you think about enterprises, partnerships are amazing, right? I mean, they can really drive the needle if you do it right. We have, like, for example, I mentioned that we actually have a deal with the US DoD and the US Veterans Association. Those two deals are actually in partnership with IBM. So was us and IBM selling together, or IBM reselling us, or selling through IBM, depending on how you want to put it. But that is basically what we have done. Amazing partner. We're doing a lot of business with them. I think we have other 4 or 6 deals that are currently in progress right now. That's very exciting. And again, it's a partner that is driving actual ARR, and it's a win-win-win situation for everyone involved, right? And it just helps you to crack in a few markets. I mean, selling to the government, that's a beast, right? So the fact that we have a partner that actually allow us to penetrate that, that's incredible. And does makes our life a little easier because now we are not like FedRAMP high certified, right? We had to do a lot of work because even if you're not like, if you don't need a certification, like it's not a proper certification, but even if you're not that, you still need to have your software approved to run on FedRAMP high servers and environments. So we had to do some work in that direction so it doesn't shortcut everything. But once that you're clear to go, I mean, partners can really help you penetrate some of this business. I mean, you go into any SI and they will work with like 450 of the Fortune 500 companies, right? Like every SI had like a finger in like all these companies. So it is important for you to actually get them to work somewhat with you on this. So we do like partnerships. Now, partnerships, like there's two things that I think founders out there need to be mindful of and operators there to be mindful of. One is there's a spectrum of founders, because it work with one is not going to mean that's going to work with the other. Like they're very different and they operate in a very different ways. Two, these companies are behemoths. They're huge. What it means that they have a lot of inertia. For you to get them moving, you're going to need to spend time on them. And there's a right time to do that as a startup, and there's a wrong time to do that as a startup. You can think that doing those partnerships early is in your benefit, but keep in mind that that's going to suck out a lot of the air out of the room, because again, there's so many people, so many different like, and the kind of partnership motion that you choose also impacts that. If you say like, hey, I'm going to collaborate on individual deals, well, that means that you're now connecting with many different account teams and you're having to tell your story again, and you have to get these teams bought into your thing. So is that effective? Now, there might be other strategies depending on the partner. So I think it's just like partnership can be very beneficial. It's just not, if you have never done it before, you need to be very mindful about understanding what is your strategy going into that.
I think that's super helpful feedback. But I want to take a step back, Joe. I mean, for a technical founder, you have a really good grasp on the business side of things and how you actually build this into a company. And I'd just be curious on your journey to getting here as a founder and a CEO. Like, how did you get to be so multifaceted? And here the question really is for anybody in the audience that's listening that's more of a technical leader and wants to get better at sales. Like, what can they do to get better at those skills?
Yeah, I gotta say, like, what surrounding you with the right people. I learned so much from my team; it's insane. I gotta say, it's very good because I would say that on top of that, you want to be very coachable, right? Like, I think the CEO's ego needs to be extremely low, and I think CEOs sometimes don't want to do that because they don't want to be perceived as fraud, or they don't want to be perceived as weak, or they're afraid how their team is going to react, right? Because what does it mean to be a low ego? Means to say I was wrong or there is a better way. And people don't like, I think CEOs, especially as their company grow, they want to be perceived as always having the answer and making sure that that drives people to be excited. And I think that is partially true, but also people respond extremely well to transparency. Like if they like, and I gotta say, if you get to tell the story about I think this was wrong and I want to do this differently now. And that's the reason why we win. They actually can see that, like, oh, damn, because this person is able to be nimble and is not saying, I was right, we're going to keep pushing in this direction, or likelihood of succeed actually increases, right? So I think there's an element to that. So I just keep myself very open. I have no problem assuming that I'm wrong and basically learning as much as I can. So I will literally sometimes my account executives will bring me into a deal, right? The deal is about to close. They're bringing a C level. They want to bring me to talk with this person. I meet them. We talk about the strategy, what it's going to look like. And then as soon as I finish that call, I actually call my account executive and I was like, hey, how did I do? Did I do it right? Did I say something that was not right? I don't think this landed well. I think this landed well. Tell me about it. And they give me feedback like, oh, I wouldn't do this. This is not right. Or, oh, this was great. I really like this. And I learned from that. And then on the next call, I apply that and they pick it up. They're like, oh, I saw that you're ready. The red changed that. I was like, yeah, like you told me last time. So I'm trying different now. So that has been very impactful for me. And especially as the job changes, as the company grows, right? Like what I was doing what I was doing in the first quarter is different than I'm doing in the second quarter. That is different than I'm doing in the third quarter. So it changes very rapidly. So I just think you gotta be extremely kind of like you're gonna need to soak in as much as you can.
I know we're getting towards the end here, but maybe one more follow up on team building and how you grew the company, because you guys are done it in a remote first way, which obviously during the pandemic was a thing, but after the pandemic and in this modern AI world has become less of a thing. As far as being able to surround yourself with the best talent, one of the things we are hearing is that a lot of people want to be back in the office, want to be here in San Francisco. Curious why you guys decided to go down this path of building remote first, and has that had any impact on being able to get the best people?
I gotta say it's interesting because when I started the company was not even a choice because I was working remotely for over 11 years, 12 years by then. So for me, it was just like, all right, this is how things are gonna go, right? I knew the people that I went to hire from the get-go, like, oh, these are the people that I would work again in a blink of an eye. And one of them is in Brazil, the other one is in New York, the other was in California. I'm just gonna go out and hire them. So from the get-go was all about like I know who I want. I just want to get these people in my team. And that was like how things started. And from that on, we just capped on the remote culture. I do gotta say that it carries an unfair advantage in terms of getting the best talent you can, right? Like you can tap into the best talent anywhere. Like you try to hire an amazing, like 1%, top 1% engineer here in SF. Like literally, you're competing with OpenAI, Anthropic, and I'm not talking competing on a like on the abstract sense. No, no, no. They're getting offers from these companies and offer from you, right? And you can sell them on the equity and all that. And that might work if you're like early on your journey and there's a lot of upside potential. But as you get Series B and now that people start to be a little more skeptical about it and they start looking like will OpenAI become SRUs at some point? And that'll be more interesting, right? So there's a lot going on in their direction. But I think like if you start to look at the global scene, and when we're doing the 1% of the globe, well, now you can tap in so many more people, right? And some of this 1% is working on a lame industry that they don't even care about. And you show up saying like, hey, do you want to work on like the cutting edge tech, like what is leading, like everything that is happening right now? And they say, hell yeah. And then you can get them. So that has been interesting. The other thing that I noticed, and we do bring the team together very often. We actually have everyone flying into SF 2 weeks from now, where we're doing our CrewAI Signal conference. But before that, we're doing an offsite. So we do get people together very often. What I notice is having people in person makes extremely easy for people to for decisions to be made. Like that is for sure. People in person decisions are faster. You just jump into a whiteboard, you draw it up, like this, and that. Someone like gives an idea, and boom, it's done. Compared to remote, where you say, "Well, let's schedule a meeting for Wednesday," right? There is that. But the opposite is also true. When I want to get heads down, like, all right, let's now execute. Being in person sometimes can get in the way. Like people are trying to get deep technical focus and they get tapped into the shoulder and like music's blasting and like, that does get in the way a little bit. So I think it's a good balance to have people meet at some point to make the hard decisions and then execute themselves.
Yeah, a lot of good nuggets there in terms of the mix between um, uh, being on site versus not. I guess just shifting gears to the maybe a favorite topic of mine, because I mindful of time here, is future gazing into what the AI landscape looks like over the next 12 to 24 months. I mean, we are not asking you 10 years, man. Like 10 years, who's seen? I mean, 12 months feels like a few years now. I mean, where do you see Crew in the ecosystem, especially as we bring more agentic stuff into the enterprise? There's this notion of uh, collaborating between humans and agents. So, how how do you sort of crystal ball gaze related to Crew, but also just beyond? I mean, beyond the scope of what Crew does. Like, what do you think are the two, three things that may shift?
Yeah, that's interesting. I gotta say, one, and this might sound obvious for some, but I don't think it's for everyone. For me, it's very clear that the genie is not getting back into the bottom. Let's put it that way. There's no word that people are not going to use agents. Like that we're long past the horizon of being able to return that way. I think the values in there, these models keep getting better. Like the People are need to getting better on kind of like putting them together. Tools are getting better. Standards are coming up. Like I think now it's all like downhill in the terms of momentum, right? Inertia. It's only going to pick up more velocity from here on, where people are going to use more and more agents as kind of like this technology matures even more. And I don't think when people realize that. The other thing is this definitely can have the bigger impact on the tech industry than I think most people realize. And you don't need to trust me to basically kind of agree with that. I would say look at what are the top leaders from the top companies doing? I mean, Sergey from Google, the guy never appeared on camera and now doing podcasts and interviews. And like, look at Satya bringing Bill Gates to do live coding with Copilot and like being blasting that out there. And you're seeing everyone kind of like getting like into wartime and going into the dirt and say like, no, 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 let's get this out there and like just promoting. And we're talking to the leaders of these companies, right? So if you're reading between the line here, if anything, to realize that this is changing the landscape in a way that no one's position is secure, right? Like they're like this can be life threatening for us as a company. How we're going to position ourselves in this new day and age, and basically pushing that forward. So I would say if you look at the signals that the market's giving, I would say you can expect this to be an even bigger impact and might change the entire tech landscape in a few years from now, depending on how that goes. So those are kind of like the obvious one for me. The more non-obvious, maybe more technical ones is I think there's going to be more people optimizing for long horizon tasks, basically agents that can run for hours. I think right now you can get that when you're doing multi agents and all that, and you have products that do that out of the gate. When you think about Raplet, for example, where they can have agents working for hours nonstop now. I think like people are now, not now, but eventually start to think about, hey, I wanted my organization to have agents that run for 3 hours with no intervention and what that looks like. So that will be an interesting one to see. And maybe more of a wild bat, I do think that fine tuning is going to make a comeback. I think like a lot of companies were not ready for it. They're still trying to figure out prompting before they actually get into that. But I think now they're way more evolved and educated. And if you pitch the value of fine tuning, where like this is going to be better, faster, and cheaper, no one's going to say no to that, right? I do think there's a lot of friction because you rely on data being right, data being tagged. So there's going to be some kind of like it's going to get a little messy, but I do see fine tuning coming back for agentic executions, especially, and I'm very excited about that. Those are some of the things that are in my mind.
I think the last point you made is super interesting. I think one of the big bottlenecks is still going to be data and how do people actually collect data, but it's I guess a longer discussion. Well, one thing I did want to ask you is you think about these next 12 months. One major competitor we're starting to hear more and more about is OpenAI's own agent builder tools, and I'm curious how you view somebody like that in the broader ecosystem, and where do you see CrewAI versus the big model players?
Yeah. I mean, when I think about competition, I would say competition for me, because there's so many ways that you compete out there, especially on the market that is so broad in terms of verticals and horizontals. You're competing for dollar amount, but you're also competing for mind share. You're competing for all these different kind of like nudges, right? I would say there's four clusters of companies that are going after this agentic opportunity. One is the hyperscalers. The other one is the model providers. Then you have bigger companies, things like Databricks, for example, and the other one is kind of like the startups, right? So I think like you have these four clusters of companies that are actually pursuing this. Now, if you think about the model providers specifically that you asked me, we are seeing is many enterprise. I know about the consumer adoption side of things, but the enterprise level being very skeptical because they don't want to get a vendor lock in. And that plays against the model providers and the hyperscalers, right? I think a lot of this enterprise leadership, they got burned from the on-prem to cloud migration, where they were told that this is going to be all unicorn and rainbows, and now they are stuck paying a huge bill of managed services. They cannot migrate off. They have 5-year-old migrating to Kubernetes projects. And it's not even that they want to migrate, they just don't have like a credible threat to negotiate a better deal, but they cannot get there, right? So what I'm seeing now is they being very skeptical. Like they understand this; they're very smart people. They understand that the market's moving extremely fast, and the likelihood for them to like, hey, I'm gonna bet everything in this one single winner is very unlikely they're gonna get that right. So they're like, you know what? I want to have something that actually allows me to have options. And that's actually when CrewAI steps in. They're like, oh, you can connect any model and you can run this on any cloud. And they're like, hell yeah, that's exactly what I want.
Well, I think we're basically at the end of time. But before we wrap up, Joe, one of the things we always like to ask our guests, and I think it's becoming more and more important, especially in this world of always being on. How do you go about decompressing, and how do you make sure that you're staying mentally fit so that you can give it your all when you're working?
Damn, that's so hard.
He has coffee. I saw him having a couple of coffees, I guess.
Yes, I gotta say, like, I kind of suck at this. I need to do a better job at this. I think every founder works extremely hard, and it is hard to decompress. And I think that you need to remind yourself that this is a marathon, is not a sprint. That said, I do think that strategically, sometimes working hard do pay off. And I think like you need to decide when you want to use that and what you're giving away to actually do it. So I won't romanticize it. It's not fun. It's not healthy, but sometimes you just need to put in the hours. And it's going to be a little bit of the crazy hours. But I got to say, that's kind of like what can make and break it sometimes, depending on how you go. So it's something that I'm trying to do better now. I think like up to this point in the company has been very crazy growth, accelerating and busy. What I'm starting to do is just establishing better boundaries, right? I have a 11-month old daughter, so I trying to establish more boundaries so I can spend some more time with her, especially on the weekends where I used to work all weekend long. So I'm trying to do some of that now that I'm trying to do a little better. But I just think that you need to be very diligent about like when you push that extra hard mode and when you don't.
Yeah, I think most of the folks we have on here have a similar sort of response. It just there's no right answer to the question. Just I think it's helpful for people to understand. And again, I think the point that you made about it's a marathon, not a sprint, is the important point. And as you're building generational defining companies, these are not 1 year, 2 year sprints. These are 10, 15 year long marathons that you need to be able to go on. But with that, Joe, thank you so much for joining us on the Unpack podcast. Arvind and I really appreciate it. And thanks to all the listeners for tuning in.
Thanks,
Thank you so
Joe.
much for having me. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Arvin.
Thanks, Joe.
Thanks again for joining the Unpacked podcast. Before we wrap up, I want to thank our partners at Stifel Bank. From general banking to venture debt, they have been incredible partners to my portfolio. Please remember to subscribe, and we'll catch you next time.